Walking along a path at the roots of Pikes Peak, you take a fork in the road toward the Anselm Society Digital Pub. Inside is a raucous conversation on the arts, faith, and whether our awe has finally overtaken our cynicism. In a corner, by the fire, are two people. One of them is staring into the embers and actively wondering about the state of his own poetic lens. And that's me, Matthew Mellema, and welcome to Believe to See, a podcast of the Anselm Society Arts Guild. The Anselm Society is a coalition of churches across the Front Range of Colorado dedicated to one very simple goal, a renaissance of the Christian imagination. So we do all sorts of things for this. We just recently had our big Imagination Redeemed conference here in Colorado. I'm recording it the day before it starts, but again, I'm projecting into the future that it was great and everyone had a wonderful time. If you want to try to get some of the materials, here's some of the speakers from that. We are in the process of uploading that to the internet, so keep a lookout for that. It'll definitely be worthwhile. To find out more about the Anselm Society, please visit us at anselmsociety.org. And while you're there, why not rate and review this show on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. It helps us out a ton. We really super duper appreciate it. And I know I say this for every show, but I really mean it. I'm very much looking forward to this show. I found out about this writer, poet, and as we were talking about in the green room, that's what we call just talking before we start recording, he is from Queens, and I have some experience with the Queens area of New York. So Ryan Diaz, welcome to the table.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, so as I mentioned to you, again, in the green room, my brother, Jeremy, he's the cool brother. Listeners, you may recognize Jeremy from the episodes we did on Bigfoot and Godzilla. Yes, we grew up on the classics in the Mellema household, but he grew up here in Colorado, moved out to Queens. He lives in Astoria. We thought he was just going to be there for a couple years and come back, but as you said, Ryan, New York got his hooks in him, and he seems there for the long haul. You did not sound surprised when I said that.
No, I think that's the whole point of New York City. It's such an overwhelming place that if you stay too long, it's like quicksand. It'll suck you in. And that's it. You'll find yourself in an apartment that's big enough for maybe one person, but 6 people live there, and that's it. You're stuck. But you love it. You complain about it, but you love it.
There you go. And you're a lifer there. Like, you're born and raised.
Yeah, I grew up in Queens. My family's originally from Puerto Rico. My grandparents on both sides came from Puerto Rico in the 60s, and we have been here ever since. My parents grew up in Brooklyn, and that's like, their point of pride. Sadly, I was born in Brooklyn, but they raised me in Queens. So, I have this competing boroughs happening, within my family. But yeah, a lifer, born and raised, and I have to say, it lives up to the name, the greatest city in the world.
Well, I am one of those people who I love visiting New York, but then I have like this claustrophobia / introversion that after a few days, like, oh my gosh, there's people all around me. People, there's too many people. So then I kind of lose my nerve. But when I'm there and using my objective, rational mind, I love it. So, again, as I was telling you, I can't wait to take my boys to this magical land of New York City where people ride trains to work every single day, blowing the brains of my 5 and 3-year-old.
Listen, it's the exact opposite for me. When I go to the countryside, I'm in the woods, I'm like, oh my gosh, this is actually what quiet sounds like.
That's the sound of not traffic and trains, yeah.
Exactly.
Oh, man. So like I said, I'm very excited to have you on the show, and you have a lot of stuff to talk about. And it's one of those things where as soon as I start reading the stuff you write, it's like, okay, this dude belongs with all of us over at Anselm. He definitely is an Anselm sort of guy. So we'll get into the specifics, but first off, let's get a little background. Tell us a little bit about who you are. We know about where you're from, but what do you do?
Yeah, so a bit about me. Like I said, from New York City, and I like to joke with people that I daylight as a pastor. I get to do a lot of pastoral work in the city, and especially in Brooklyn, and a lot of that's around spiritual formation and just teaching people how to walk out the way of Jesus. But I moonlight as a writer and a poet. At least I like to pretend I do. And so that all kind of, I've always loved literature, reading, and writing. I went to school to be a historian and then got caught up in just the work of ministry and working in the local church. And that turned into several fruitful years of just working in and around the city, working with youth, young adults. And then at some point along that journey, I got married to an incredible wife who is definitely the better half and who, indulges my ever-growing book collection. The reality is that being in New York City in small apartments, you can imagine what it's like to own books. And so she has allowed me to continue to build this collection. And then from there, really started doing graduate school and biblical studies to kind of continue to add on that. But even as I'm doing this sort of local church ministry work, there's this little inner poet writer that was always there. And so kind of that had its emergencies for me. It peaks out every once in a while. But funnily enough, when the pandemic hit and, New York City was a ground zero for very severe lockdowns, I found myself with a lot of time on my hands. I found myself also between kind of vocations. I was kind of leaving a position I was at for a very long time to kind of take a step of faith with my family. And lo and behold, I realized maybe I should start writing again.
Yeah, and I found that so interesting. So I was reading an article you wrote in Dappled Things called Faith Without Awe is Dead, and it was sort of your story of coming back to poetry. And I found that so fascinating, but let's sort of take a step back from there. So I'm interested in what got you hooked on poetry in the first place. So you go to college for history. I had several very good friends who were historians in college. Not all of them were especially poetic, but some of them were. So what got you going on poetry as you're studying history?
Yeah, so I think there's the background story to like that kind of experience, and maybe like in those college years was, I remember distinctly about being like 11 years old. My dad, he worked in the city. He worked for the Army Corps of Engineers, and he used to take me sometimes to work with him. And they used to do these little bookshop in like the lobby sometimes. It was like, it's like the Scholastic Book Fair, but for adults working at this Federal Plaza building. And so whenever he would have this and I was there, he would take me. And I remember distinctly being about 10, 11, him taking me. And I remember he got me this little paperback edition of The Hobbit. I had never read it before. I had never, it was just my first introduction to Tolkien. And I remember being different from all the other kids because when the little songs and poems came up, that's when I kind of slowed down and piqued my interest. And I remember distinctly like reading those things aloud to myself, trying to find the rhythms and the cadences. That beautiful poem towards the end where it's like the roads go ever on, over rock and under tree, by caves where never sun has shone, by streams that never find the sea. And I remember reading them like, oh my God, this is like magic. I was just so shocked. And that always stayed within me. So when I hit college and I started doing history, and I found this love for not necessarily the raw facts of history, but the fact that history is the business of storytelling, that all historians are telling stories. And so every kind of step in my life, there's always been this drawing back to this idea that story and language is this powerful thing. And I think over the years, that has always kind of been like a seed kind of planted really deep down below that kind of really sprouted, honestly, that kind of took its full form in the beginning of 2020, where all of a sudden I realized, oh my gosh, maybe I should start writing again. And that seed that was planted by that 11-year-old boy reading lines of The Hobbit to himself began to take shape.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because I was reading through your brand new first poetry collection, and the fact that you say that you like the first spark was Tolkien, it's like, okay, I can totally see that in like this echo of it in your poem. So that's really helpful to sort of connect that dot. So I am very curious about this in general because I write prose, and I will admit I've never had a problem like diving in and writing prose. Like when I was a kid, I'd write short stories. When I was 17, I tried my best to write the great American novel. Didn't quite work, but I gave it a good shot. But I was always just a little intimidated to like write a poem. It was like, do I need to read like a book or something before I do this? What do I do? So you obviously dove right in there. So what motivated you to do that?
I think part of the motivation was, one was like a very practical motivation, and one was very much like, it's just, something deep down within me, just like I needed to do this. But the very practical motivation was poems can be short. And so there was a sense in which I write prose as well. And so I am like, I think like most writers, I have this proverbial problem of actually, finishing things and bringing them to their conclusion. I have many a great American novel sitting somewhere in a Google Drive somewhere and unfinished, halfway through. And so one of the challenges to myself was when I was like going to start writing again, kind of in the early part of 2020, part of the challenge, like I need to get into the habit of finishing things. And I had this great love for language. And so I began to, and I had dabbled. I had written, poems in college. Like I think every college has like a love affair with the beat poets. And you read like On the Road by Kerouac, and all of a sudden you're like, in a truck, touring America, writing crazy things that don't rhyme. And so like I had that moment. So that love of language is there, but I think it was just this like, I need to learn how to finish things. And I need to learn how to just get something down on paper. And secondly, was as opposed to prose, there is this sense in poetry that it's about what you say, but it's also less about what you say. And it's about how it's said. And so for someone who had this almost this love affair with the magic of like the sounding out of language, the etherealness of like that poem's for me almost like an incantation, it's like it's this spell that you're kind of writing out. And so I think for me that was also like I had a lot of stuff happening in that season. I was like, man, just doing a journal entry or writing an essay on this isn't going to do the trick. I need to, talk to the muses and get some poems on paper. And so I think those kind of to this desire for like, hey, I can write short poems. They can be done. They can be finished. And secondly, this kind of desire to also like embrace this sort of beauty, transcendent beauty that I think is really found in poetry in a unique way.
Yeah, I totally agree. And as you were talking about that, I'm thinking about my the first poems you read when you're young and that just like totally bowl you over. So I'm thinking about a poem I read by Edwin Arlington Robinson back in the day, or Edgar Allan Poe. I was all about him for that kind of what you talked about. The musicality is sort of like an incantation, like his poem, The Bells. Like, oh my gosh, I didn't know words could do that. It's so amazing, especially when you first discover it. It's like a whole new world that opens up to you. But let's go with the narrative. I'm glad you put it in terms of story and the importance of story, because I've mentioned on this podcast a few times, but one of the emphases that Anselm is trying to do for this next season is talk about, the grand story and putting yourself as part of the grander story, God's story of the universe. And I love the themes you've drawn on along those lines. But one of the things you were writing about in some of your prose that I was reading is sort of this journey from cynicism to rediscovering how poetry was involved. So tell me about that. So you talked about you're young, you encounter poetry for the first time, then you go through this cynicism patch. What was that like?
Yeah, so it was about, I remember it clear as day. It must have been 2018, 2019. And again, context for everyone, right? I'm in pastoral ministry. I preach often. I do spiritual direction for people, right? So like, you would think that, I'm ticking all the boxes of someone who has this sort of deep faith. And then I'm sitting in a service, and the church I was working at the time is this, this non-denominational church which has like roots in the charismatic movement. So, it's very full of energy and life, and people are praying aloud. And I remember sitting there with my arms crossed, completely unmoved. And it was scary at first because, I've grown up in church. My mom worked for a church for many years. I've been around the things of God. I've been around the story of Jesus for a very long time. I'd like to think of myself as a deeply profound spiritual person. I like to at least imagine myself that way. I've read all the right books, right? I read Thomas Merton. I read Henry Nouwen. So I like to think I had this very cultivated, deep faith. And then I realized I'm in this service, my arms closed, completely shut off to everything that's happening around me. And so this was a scary feeling. And so I had to investigate. I had to figure out why. And after some soul searching, some conversation with some wise friends and family, I realized I had grown cynical. It wasn't doubt. I think this is important to distinguish between doubt and cynicism. See, doubt is the partner of faith. Doubt helps deepen faith because doubt is still open to being overwhelmed with mystery. Doubt is still open to experiencing awe and wonder because doubt is asking questions, hoping that they find answers. And so as I'm realizing I'm not doubting, something worse has happened. Something, the complete opposite of doubt and faith is happening. And I realized it was cynicism. And what I mean by cynicism is it's this arrogant attitude towards the mystery of God. This attitude that puts God in this square box that assumes that what can be known about God, that assumes the mysterious, the transcendent, those things that aren't in your control, that you have put them in your control. And what it did was I was no longer awed by the grace of God. I was no longer feeling overwhelmed at the mystery of this triune God who somehow in his second person became incarnate to meet humanity where it's at. No. Those things no longer awakened anything in me. It had become dead because I had, for some reason, and we can talk about what I think some of the reasons are why we become so cynical. I had assumed I had all the answers. And so really my questioning and my encounter with spirituality and my walk with Jesus wasn't one of deep faith or deep doubt that's leading towards faith. It was one of, I got this. I figured all this thing out. I need nothing else. And honestly, all the deep, mysterious questions, I think I have an answer for. And even when I did ask questions, I had an answer in mind already. There weren't genuine questions. They were questions designed to help me feel in control. So ultimately, cynicism was about control. It was about, I'm uncomfortable with this transcendent God who can overwhelm me, overpower me, who can completely turn my world upside down. So the best thing I can do is pretend that he actually can't do that. And so I kind of made this movement, unbeknownst to me, kind of under the radar. Dante has in the opening lines of the Inferno, he says, midway along the journey of life, I woke to find myself in a dark wood, for I wandered off from the straight path. And a few lines later, he says, how I wound up there, I do not know. That's what happened. I had wound up in this place of utter, complete hardness of heart, this cynicism towards the things of God, in a position where I probably should have been the most sensitive person to the things of God. And all of a sudden, here I am, hardened of heart, not knowing what to do next.
Yeah, the story you're telling there, that is resonating with me so deeply. I went through something very, very similar. I remember shortly after I graduated from college, I was in that stage where I'd done a lot of reading like church history and a lot of very good and useful stuff by professors who are like, hey guys, before we teach you all this stuff, don't be arrogant, okay? Don't get all puffed up with what you know. And I kind of nod along. Yeah, that you're right. That's important. But then without realizing it, I found myself being puffed up by what I knew and being in church and thinking, these simple folks all around me, they don't know the things I know. And like you said, it's that attitude of, oh, I have this. I've put a box around it, which is so easy to do without realizing it. But a question for you here is, like, your story of cynicism really resonates, but your story is using poetry to sort of combat the cynicism and sort of having it help you lead you out of it. But so often, there's so many movements in poetic history where the cynicism is the point. So how is it that you use the poetry to get you out of cynicism when so often it's used for the opposite purpose?
Yeah, so again, it's the beginning of 2020 now. I'm in this major sort of life transition and still dealing with this sort of, this deeply rooted cynicism. But at this point, I had at least acknowledged it and wanted to deal with it. The question was how, right? You can diagnose, but then you need a treatment plan. And so I realized something, and it happened kind of suddenly. I was kind of unpacking some books, and I stumbled upon there's like an old volume of Keats I had, and like as poets like Keats go, and a lot of the romantic writers, there is this in their writing, there is this utter wonder at these transcendent things that are hidden within the everyday. You think of Ode to a Nightingale. You think of, I just posted it on my Instagram because the first day of autumn, and so to autumn is this completely beautiful kind of approaches to these mundane, earthly things that all of a sudden transport them to this transcendent world. And I began to think, like, hold on here. Poets throughout history, on the flip side, have also used poetry to get access to the transcendent, to embrace that glimmer of beauty that hides behind the veneer of the mundane. And so I said, if part of my issue is that, like, I no longer have any awe, I no longer have any wonder, if I'm approaching this thing called God with this perspective that's cut off from any willingness to be overwhelmed by his mystery, then maybe I need to start writing things and just trying to see that transcendent mystery in my everyday life. And maybe if I could train myself, and maybe some of the magic will rub off on me, that as I read more poetry and I begin to write more, maybe some of that hardness of heart will begin to fall away. And so that's what I began to do. I began to write poetry. And really, it was therapeutic. It was trying to get past this guard I had up by being willing to acknowledge that there's mystery and transcendence and beauty beyond my comprehension, and that it can either be a thing that I shield myself from or totally embrace. And so what I began to do is write poems that made me embrace it, that made me see it, and made me grapple with it. And that's how slowly but surely, as I began to write more poetry, and as I began to think about these things more deeply, I became more and more open. And all of a sudden, it translated to how I prayed. And so all of a sudden now, as I'm praying, it's not this dead prayer that's kind of, checking your boxes. It's this living prayer that's willing to say, God, I honestly don't have words, but I'm willing to be overwhelmed by you. I'm willing to, I think you read a lot of the mystics, they talk about this, the Beatific Vision, this kind of all-encompassing encounter with the very love of God. And that requires a capacity for wonder that if you're cynical, you cannot inhabit, you can't approach it, you can't deal with it, because ultimately to deal with that is to give up control. To encounter us to give up control. And so the act of writing the poetry was slowly ceding control to that inner cynic, that voice that said, put God in the box, put the world in a box, cement your worldview. And C.S. Lewis has this he's talking about love. I think it applies here. If you can harden your heart to such a point that, you'll never be damaged, but you also never experience anything. And I think for some Christians, and sometimes Christian artists as well, there's a sense in which, because we've been damaged or because we've experienced something, that, like, if I can just put a rein on God, I'll avoid that. And sure, you can do that, but you're robbing yourself of your capacity for awe and wonder. And poetry seems to be a vehicle in which we're forced to encounter that. And while poetry can be used to write cynically, there's no doubt about that. I think the intention going in was to write poetry that wasn't cynical. Because, again, like, cynicism, the direct result of cynicism is nihilism. If ultimately, right, like, I put everything into a neat little box, and I've robbed myself of any sort of transcendent experience, well, then I'm also just robbing myself of any sort of meaning and deep value to life. And so I think part of the writing the poetry, the reason it worked, was the intentionality of saying, I have to overcome this thing.
Yeah, and I love the way you put it earlier when you were talking about cynicism as opposed to doubt, where doubt can be, a helper of faith in many ways. And that is so true, because I think probably most, if not all of us, have gone through, seasons of doubt in our lives. And during those times, usually triggered by, oh, here's this new thing. It's made my world a little bigger. Oh my gosh, can my faith fit this new big thing in it? Then, you wrestle with it and you realize, oh, okay, yes, my faith is big enough to accommodate this new thing. So your world gets a little bit bigger going forward. Whereas cynicism, it involves a very small world. Cynicism has this veneer of sophistication. coming up is like, I see what's going on here. I know what's going on. I'm the sophisticate here. But it's when you go a little bit below the surface, there's not much beneath the surface because it assumes, oh, I know exactly what's going on here. So you're cynical toward politics. Oh, I know exactly why all these politicians are doing what they're doing. You're cynical toward the church. Oh, I know exactly why all these church people are doing what they're doing. There's no space for wonder there. And I love the way you tried to find it. You sought it is through writing poetry about the mundane things. I'm thinking about a poem that G.K. Chesterton wrote called Modern Elfland, where, Chesterton lived in London, so, this big city, early 20th century. And the poem is him, mourning the fact that so much of, the old woods, some of the old fairy stories that seems to be in the past with this new modern thing. But then he learns to look at it through the proper lens, and London suddenly gets this sense of awe back, this wonder back. So I guess my question to you then is, how is it especially helpful to write about the mundane things? You didn't stand by the shore of the ocean. You didn't climb a giant mountain. You didn't stand in a giant cathedral. You wrote about common day things. What is there especially about finding the awe in the commonplace that you found so helpful?
I think partly because that's the Christian story. There's that beautiful part of the Psalm where the psalmist says, what is humanity that you're mindful of us? That you've made us a little lower than the angels, and that in the creative order, God has taken man made of dust and has seen this beauty that he's imbued in him. And so that is also then the mystery of the incarnation, is that in this flesh body of the person Jesus of Nazareth is the God-man. And so there is this sense that part of the Christian story is to find God in the seemingly unexpected places. We have this great, in the prophetic text, we have this great moment with Elijah where, when God is not in the fire, he's not in the storm, he's not in the rumblings of the earth, but he's in the still small voice. And so it seems part of human communication with God is to look at the things that are seemingly despised. Again, Paul talks about this where he says, God uses the foolish things of this world to confound the wise, that the seeming meaningless or the seeming mundane are still imbued with some of God's creative potential, so that no thing in this world is beyond pointing us to God. They're all signposts in some way. And you have Augustine, who talks often about this, where, his idea of having an ordered love towards God is to use everything for the enjoyment of God. So that goes from the highest of human relationships to the lowest of observations about the created order. When we see someone, I wrote a poem in the collection called A Morning Liturgy, and it's literally about my morning routine. And then all of a sudden I'm realizing that this morning routine is somehow a liturgy. It's somehow like the great liturgies of old, in the repetition and in the mundane acts, they're imbued with something far beyond them, which is, again, the power of the sacraments. It's, baptism is a sacred form of bathing. The Eucharist is a sacred form of feasting. And so these are normal, mundane things. We don't think twice when we take a shower. We often don't think twice when we put food into our mouths. And yet God says, I'll use those things as powerful means of grace for people to see in them the very grandeur of God. And so, it's like Hopkins says, the grandeur of God, it's imbued in all the created order. And so when you write about especially really things that are seemingly valueless, I think you're participating in the Christian story. In incarnational theology, if you would. You're learning to see even in the details everyone else overlooks, those details have not been overlooked by God. And there's something in them valuable that can show us a glimpse of the Creator.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm thinking about the Hopkins poem. The first line is, "Glory be to God for dappled things." And then he just lists a whole bunch of different things that are dappled, from like fish to fire embers. So I love the way you put that, and I love the way that you focus on the mundane, because the Christian story is about God focusing on the mundane. So I wonder if we can go to the effect of cynicism on art in particular. There's this popular caricature of an artist. I think that's sort of out in the culture at large of this artist is sort of like this world weary cynic who's, smoking his cigarettes and wearing a beret and going to off Broadway productions. I feel like you would say that if you have art that is just relying on cynicism, that will harm the art. What is the harmful effects on cynicism as an artist?
Yeah, I think first we have to like understand that caricature of an artist is a modern invention. We see kind of before the Enlightenment, we have a kind of a theism that imbues at least Western society. So there's this belief in a personal God, and primarily there's Christian God. And as we see kind of movements happen in the West, we kind of see move from theism to deism, where now that God is no longer personal, no longer involved in the creative order. And now he's this creative being. He's the clockmaker up there somewhere, but he really doesn't care too much about us. And then from deism, you kind of move to atheism, right? Now all of a sudden, the God, actually, we take him out the equation. As Nietzsche declares, God is dead. But it's actually Nietzsche who then says, well, actually, the direct result of that, you take that out, you take the transcendent out of the equation. That's the direct result of that is nihilism. There's no meaning at all. And so the artist I think we're sort of portraying in this caricature is sort of like a Nietzschean artist. He is the existential nihilist who sees no meaning in reality. And so the only commentary he has on reality is cynicism, because he can allow himself to be overwhelmed by maybe a transcendent good somewhere out there, something beyond himself. All he can offer is critiques on the world he's inherited. And ultimately, that nihilism is, I believe, self-destructive. That cynicism is self-destructive. And so I think, like, we first have to root that caricature, and that this is a modern invention. That if we were to go back a few hundred years, that artists weren't thinking like that. That artists did seem to be actively engaging in art that valued and actually believed in the transcendent. We can go all the way back to the Greeks and the Muses, right? There's this, that good art flows from beyond, and the poet is almost like an oracle, sort of taking note. And so I think the negative effects is when we lose that capacity for wonder, we're actually losing touch with an entire tradition. And so what we think is, as artists, we think, well, the only caricature I have, this only kind of role model I have is the cynical, like the cynical beat, to bring back to our earlier point, the cynical beat poet, right? Making observations about the brokenness of the world. But I think actually for artists, we have to realize we have other archetypes. We have other things to look towards that don't have to result in art that's purely cynical commentary on creation. I think there's room for art that certainly wrestles with the complexities. We don't want pedantic art. We don't want art that merely self-serving in some sort of didactic way. But we also don't want art that ultimately, its ultimate expression is, life is meaningless, look how meaningless it is. And honestly, to be quite, this is a personal opinion of mine, I think sometimes it doesn't make for great art, because you can't bring that anywhere. That doesn't go anywhere. At least philosophically, that the logical conclusion is, if all things have been robbed of meaning, actually why make art? Mm-hmm. And so I think we have to, number one, realize that ultimately that nihilistic, cynical caricature, it's ultimately self-defeating, because ultimately what you would end up questioning the very art you make. And so that's certainly not creating more room for more beautiful art. But then also, that's not the only, as artists, that's not the only archetype we have. There's the archetypes of old that are people who are saying, no, art is participating in something divine. And in a way that's beautiful, and in a way that's dealing with the strenuous nature of reality without conceding to some sort of cynicism or nihilism.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with what you're saying there. And another thing I think we could add that you discussed earlier is it's actually very safe to be a cynic.
Right.
Because when you're a cynic, you're not risking anything. All you're doing is poking holes in the bigger thing over there. It's so easy to just criticize somebody else's stuff. It can be fun and it's easy, but it's not really the sort of thing that makes for great art in the long run. Whereas I can feel this in me all the time. In the things that I write, I am afraid to demonstrate genuine emotion in my characters because it makes me feel vulnerable. When you try to sincerely portray an emotionally charged scene that tries to portray something good and true and beautiful, you might fail. And when you fail, that doesn't feel good. It makes you feel vulnerable to put yourself out there. It's much safer to stay in your cynic shell and just, throw darts at everyone else from a safe distance. So something related to what we have been talking about, you mentioned it again in another one of your articles that you wrote about the concept of the poetic lens and the vocation of poets. And it seemed like you wanted to extend the vocation of poets to more than just the folks who, regularly publish poetry. What do you mean by the vocation of poets?
That's a great question. I think one sort of way to see poets in the poetic lens, the vocation at least, is to see people who are looking at the subtext of life. People who are looking beneath the surface for deeper meaning. And so I think ultimately that is the poet's job, is to take culture beneath the topsoil, to take people beneath the veneer. You have this kind of beautiful image in the Old Testament of the temple. You have this progression through the temple until you get to the Holy of Holies. And I think that's part of the poet's job. It's taking people on this journey where they kind of go from these outer courts of this is mundane life, this is my everyday, and all of a sudden showing them that there's far more beauty and grandeur to behold. And so in that article I wrote, I kind of wanted to let people know that this isn't just the job of someone who puts lines on paper, that every human being, number one, has a capacity to experience God and thus experience the transcendent. And on top of that, then if we are all made in the image of God and all share in this imaging vocation, right? The idea of the image of God often gets associated with man's reason or some sort of metaphysical quality that man has. But also the image of God can be understood as a vocation. It is a call to go into the world and steward creation and bring further beauty out of creation. It's why he puts the implication in the Hebrew storytelling method is that when God places Adam in Eden, is that Eden is this plot of land that's borders need to expand. And so there's part of the human vocation, which is, as poets, there's this hidden beauty and because of sin, really, because of the fall, this transcendent beauty. They used to, remember the idea of God walking in the garden, is the idea that the divine is ready and available and accessible. Because of sin, there's this kind of cutoff. And so part of the human vocation and the poetic vocation is to reconnect people that by showing them what's lying beneath, until, like we get in Revelation, the whole creation is filled with the glory of God. So then all of a sudden, this is where there's an eschatological dimension to the poetic vocation. In the end, poets won't be needed in the sense that we won't need them as guideposts. We won't need them to show kind of what's beneath the topsoil because God's going to fill all things. But as for now, those living between the ages, we have this job as poets and also as humans to walk other people up close and personal with life, with creation, and then show them that everything is imbued with the divine, that God's meaning and purpose and creative spark flows through all things. And I think on a literary sense, like every Christian artist, I'm going to talk about Tolkien for 5 seconds, right? There's this sense in which Tolkien does this in a meta sense in his entire narrative of Middle-earth, in that he brings you so up close and personal to the world, and through the world communicates there's so much more going on in this world than you realize, that providence and grace are imbued into the story. And it's only then when you kind of come out and then you say, wow, I have to read the Silmarillion, that you realize, okay, yeah, there's actually forces and things at work that are never expressed in the actual writing of those big stories. but they're there. And I think our job as poets and then as humans is just to do the same thing. Just give people hints and signs that there's far more going on here than we realize.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love the fact that you phrased it like that. And going back to that same piece that you wrote, you talk about the concept of how art really doesn't exist for its own sake. Art, when done properly, will point to God ultimately. There was this movement, I think it was like the pre-Raphaelites, had this saying, "Art, we make art for art's own sake," but that would be falling short in our vocation as Christians. We shouldn't just make it about the art. We should make it about pointing to God through our art.
Right. I think even like Lewis does this so well in the Narnia series when you kind of have that moment. I think it's in the Dawn Treader where he says, you've known me here so that you might know me more there. Just to paraphrase that line. And so what Aslan is saying in that moment to the children is not that their experiences in Narnia aren't real. It's not that they don't matter, but that their ultimate purpose leads them beyond Narnia. And so, just like us, I would hate for people to walk away with that all of a sudden just it has this purely kind of utilitarian purpose of like an evangelistic tool. No, it's not saying that. It's that we need to experience true beauty. We need to experience art for itself, and yet when we experience art for itself, that experience is not for itself. It goes beyond itself. And so it's a very real experience. When you read that poem and you're overawed with the beauty of it, that experience is real, but then that experience then also takes you beyond that. And so I think that would be like a great clarifying point. Like, it doesn't mean that art needs to then just be some sort of pedagogic tool, but it is pedagogic in the sense where it teaches us and informs us, informs our vision really to see. So we might see clearly, as Paul says, right now we see through a veil, but one day we'll see face to face. I think poetry kind of works in that way to teach us how to see face to face.
Yeah, that is a really important point that you brought up too. It's not, we need to use art to point to God, so our art must therefore be like this formulaic thing to teach a simple lesson. Oftentimes the way we point to God is by pointing to a mystery, pointing to something that we're in awe of and we can't wrap our minds around. And that makes for complicated art sometimes, but that can
exactly.
be a very good thing. Yeah, so now let's turn to your specific art. So listeners, Ryan just had his, by the time you all are listening to this book will be out and hot off the presses. It's his poetry collection for those wandering along the way by Whip and Stock Publishers. So Ryan, tell us a little bit about this collection. Does it have a specific theme? You talked about writing it along the way in 2020 with the COVID shutdowns. Did that inform it? What would you say the general thrust of this collection is?
So really the first kind of poem, the title poem, is a poem about poetry. I'll read a line just to give the readers some context, but the opening line says, "These are the songs we sing on the way." And so that line gets repeated throughout that opening poem. And it is a poem about poetry, that through this journey called life, and for me, poetry and prayer are synonymous. In the book, I kind of have an opening quote from Derek Walcott where he says, "I have never separated the writing of poetry from prayer. I've grown up believing it is vocation, a religious vocation." And so kind of for me, those two terms are synonymous, and that poems are the things we use to make sense of the world as we wander through it. And when we don't know what to say, and that's one of the refrains in the poem, that opening poem, is like, when we don't know what to say, these are the songs we sing on the way. And so for me, that's kind of what poetry did for me in this season of kind of as like being like a recovering cynic. These are the songs I sing to myself that keep me on the way. And so that theme of that use of poetry, I think, is the key theme throughout the book. While topically, poems hit on everything from like personal confessional poetry to reflections on the nature of Christ to even a political poem or two, it's all hearkening back to these are things we can use as we maneuver the complexities of life and try to find our way. And so that's kind of really the heart of the book, where it's kind of, hey, this collection right here, a lot spoken on, but please use this as some sort of, the hymn you hum to yourself on the road as you kind of journey through life.
I love that. I love the connection that we can bring back to The Hobbit, where we
Yeah.
have the songs for walking down the road.
Yeah.
Yeah, so just a couple of very quick questions for you about this collection. So I've been reading through the poems, and I noticed that you have a lot of form, you have a lot of meter, you have sort of this elevated language. And was that an intentional decision you made, or when you started writing the poems, did you find it just sort of came out that way?
I think yes. That's the answer to that question. It's yes to both. Edna St. Vincent Millay, American poet, she has this poem, and the opening line is, "I will put chaos into 14 lines." And I that resonates with me so much. And so for me, the form piece is this sort of, number one, I think it's therapeutic to have form. There's some biblical scholars. So the Book of Lamentations, for those of you who may have not seen the original Hebrew parts of it we have in our English Bibles, you won't notice it, but it's an acrostic. And so there's Lamentations, which is one of the darkest poems in the Bible, if not the darkest, is this form poetry. And so I think a lot of times we think about the overflow of human emotions. I think nowadays we correlate that with free verse, right? Like, I'm just going to pour out my soul, and however it comes out, it comes out. And that's an oversimplification of free verse. But I do believe there's something to form in helping us constrain and deal with the overflow of the human soul. So some scholars think in Lamentations, they use acrostics because what has happened to the city of Jerusalem is so overwhelming that without any sort of guiding line, they're at a loss for words. And so I think this idea of putting chaos into 14 lines is, I need the form. I need the kind of the boundary markers to show me where to play. And so that's partly intentional, but also part of it, I think, is just how it came out. I think there's a reactionary piece to it, in which we live in a culture that says unrestrained freedom is freedom. And there's this beautiful line in the Book of Common Prayer, I think it's from one of the collects, and it says, his service is perfect freedom. So part of the Christian narrative is that it's through actually submitting myself to something greater than myself. In that submission, real freedom in life is born. I think the same can be said for poetry, in that by constraining ourselves, we are forced to invent and do and create in ways we would never have thought of if we were just allowed to run free. I say all that to say there are a few free verse poems in the collection. And so, I think what this is more of a guideline than it is a hard rule. But I really do believe Edna's onto something.
I love that line that you said about the chaos in 14 lines. I'm probably going to look up that poem as soon as we're done recording here. I think what you said about needing the form and structure, it fits well with the theme of your poetry collection too. For those wandering along the way, if you are wandering, what do you need? You need a map. You need something to give you order. You need something to lay on that to make sense of it. So I think that serves a really great function for the collection there.
Yeah, so I think too, then it comes back to this sense of why do we need form if we're going to participate in a conversation, right? I think for me, form is participation in a conversation that's happened before. So I think for me too, someone who's a bit of a traditionalist in the best sense is by writing a sonnet, I am communicating with all the other sonnets that have come before me, right? There's bits of Shakespeare and there's bits of, and all of a sudden now I love the idea of being part of a long tradition. And so I think that's part of it too, is I don't know if you know, but there's Baylor College is the 100 Days of Dante, and that's a whole thing that happens this time of year. And so I've been reading through Dante again, and part of that is there's so many callbacks, and again it reminds you that this poet is part of a bigger world. I think form does that in some sense for us.
Yeah, absolutely, and I totally agree. That is one of the many reasons why I've always been drawn to formal poetry as well. And oh man, we are unfortunately running out of time, but Ryan, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. So glad we can make this work. So once again, folks, name of the poetry collection is For Those Wandering Along the Way by Ryan Diaz. Please check it out. As you're listening to this, it is hot off the presses, so please look it up. It will be worth your while. And Ryan, where can we find you?
Yeah, you can find me at my website. It's www.avagueidea.com. And then also on Instagram at ryan.diaz.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you once again. And listeners, as you can probably tell, things are winding down at the Anselm Digital Pub. The fire is down to embers, the customers are trundling home, and you've polished off your final glass. Once again, Believe to See is a podcast of the Anselm Society. Thank you all for joining us, and we'll see you next time.